Hello and welcome to another kitchen pedagogy video. In this episode I'm going to be talking about the power of student talk for helping them to check their understanding, develop some fluency with key vocabulary, and also to help them with schema building, as well as giving teachers some feedback about the depth of their understanding. Now, there's a lot packed into that, but what I think happens quite often in lessons is that students are left to sort of puzzle this out for themselves or internalise thoughts which are not sufficiently aired, so they don't get enough chance to check whether their own sense of things is correct. And the teacher can only really sample a few at a time, and then it's always public. If we get students to talk to each other more and we structure pair talk well, so many things can happen. You can get students to use the vocabulary that you're asking them to internalise and learn to understand without it having to only be through the written form. And in doing that, they can also be thinking aloud and thinking, what do I understand by this phenomenon? So for example, if you want students to say, even relay a story. Now, what happens in the scene with the three witches at the beginning of Macbeth, for example? What's going on there? What are the key kind of characters doing, and what's the significance of that? Now, do you understand that? Well, I think I do, but how do I know? Now, a quick thing to do is then to get students to talk through that in a pair and just check what they think they understand. And in doing that, they're starting to weave in some of the terminology and some of the concepts around that you've just aired yourself as the teacher. It could be something like, what's the difference between day and night? And often even adults start thinking, do I know? Why is it day and night? Is it 24 hours? Is it the earth going around the sun? No, that's nothing to do with that. And is it to do with the tilt of the earth? No, it's not to do with that. And just various variables come into play, and you have to think through what is the selection of ideas I need in order to explain this phenomenon. Now, you might just say that we could do all that through writing and visuals, but as a precursor to that, or as part of that, getting students to articulate things like rotating on its axis and saying a phrase like that helps them to think that through. If there's any vocabulary terminology that you want students to have, if they're not all using it and saying it, it's unlikely that it's going to be embedded as part of their repertoire. And you can only go so far with call response. So if you can engineer questions in a pair so students have to use certain terminology, then they're going to get practice. A good example which I can show you here is, say, something around it, something sort of physical I can show you. So let's say imagine we're trying to get students to understand the concept of condensation. Well, I've created some condensation right here by putting some ice in a beaker of water. And if I feel the outside, it's wet. And it wasn't a few minutes ago. It was a dry glass, and it's now wet on the outside. And it's wet because water has condensed from the atmosphere onto the cold glass. So I can get students to talk that through with their partner and start using the phrase, what has happened, it's called condensation. What's happened to the water? The water condenses on the cold beaker. Why does it happen? And they can start using words condense, condenses, condensation to explain what's happening. And they can also start to visualize some sort of schema for the particles which are previously in the air now condensed as a liquid on the surface. And that also explains why it's wet. So they're connecting a physical thing to the terminology. And that all happens because they're thinking about it in the small space. It's much more difficult to engineer all of that thinking if you've had to do it through sampled students one by one by one. So if the students have had that chance to discuss and you've structured the discussion so that there are certain answers they need to give and certain bits of terminology they need to use, and then you go to a cold call and say, right, so let's hear some of those responses, you get deeper levels of engagement. And as a basic rule of thumb, I always say to teachers is this: would it have been possible to be in your lesson and not have used the words that you wanted them to learn? And if that's the case, then maybe the structure of the activities wasn't sufficient. Now, it might have been that some of them had to use them, but not everybody. And so you need to start thinking, how do I get everyone talking and using words? Well, pair share is the quickest way to do that. You might just say, well, I'm happy for them to write them down, and that can be useful, of course, that can follow through. Or it can be a precursor to the discussion. You jot your ideas down and now you share those. But I really think that unless you're verbalizing your terminology, it's not then something you're comfortable to volunteer at when that's appropriate to do that. So try to make sure you've got good routines where, without losing control or feeling that's an issue, you can get students talking productively in a focused way, using good prompt questions to make sure the terminology is part of what they're thinking about, and then bring them together so that you can hear what they were saying. Some teachers sometimes opt for what I call a kind of university tutorial approach, where you think it's okay just to spar and busk and ask for students like we're having a great class discussion. And that only goes so far, because even in those discussions, not everybody is going to be participating in any sort of class size beyond, 8 or 10. You just can't get everybody involved if you are relying on the one-to-one kind of informality of that kind of tutorial style. So think hard about that as well. Sometimes it feels like students are all thinking, but actually it's still only a small number. And the discipline and the structure of a pair share where everyone is thinking is the way to get everybody airing their thoughts, hearing what they said, and then trying to work out whether they understand it as well as you hearing later what they understood.